When the pro-Hamas riots happened in Columbia University recently, a month or two ago, whenever that was, we covered that. We covered, the fact that it was happening, the way the university responded, and of course, there is the aftermath, which is, what we're going to talk about today. So in a panel discussion last week in Columbia University about anti-Semitism and about how Jews are treated on campus, several of the senior staff at Columbia were texting each other, mocking some of what was going on in the panel, and telling us what we already know about what Jewish students can expect in Columbia University. To their credit, I think the dean suspended three of the four who were involved in that, right? And to their discredit, the fourth was the dean himself, who has not been suspended. So anyway, that is our topic today. What's going on in Columbia? What happened with that panel, and what can specifically Jewish students expect going forward. Welcome to the Daily Objective. I'm joined by Morgan. Morgan, your thoughts on this panel?
Well, I don't want to say that I'm unsurprised, but given the broadly, I think, disgraceful attitude that we've seen from university officials towards the treatment of Jewish students since October 7th and towards the protests that have gone on their campuses, there's a sense in which we shouldn't have been surprised. Now, it's always surprising when you see just the raw hostility like this. So, for people who aren't too familiar with this story, as Razi's saying, the panel is going on, which is looking into the anti-Semitism on campuses. And now you might expect the people who are running a university to be really concerned about that if they have the welfare of their students in mind. And yet the kind of messages they were sending was they were utterly ridiculing the experiences of the students, because students were standing up and telling about their experiences of anti-Semitism or actively being attacked. And the kind of thing that these officials were sending to each other, and as you say, Razi, including the dean, they were sending like vomiting emojis to each other. One of them was saying, because I think one of the people speaking was an alumni or something like that. One of them said, "Oh, this person's just is playing this up for fundraising, so just to raise some money," and all this kind of stuff, right? So it's completely ridiculing, demeaning the whole experience of these Jewish students. And it should be utterly disgraceful. And part of the story is that these people have now been reprimanded by, I think, one of the members of the House of Representatives who's on a certain committee who's demanded to see the messages, who's investigating this. So there has been some, proper backlash against this. But unfortunately, given the controversy we saw, I think it must have been at the last part of last year now, in one of the Congress committees where the heads of some of these four big universities came and displayed similar kind of awful attitudes towards the experience of Jewish students on campus. Given that, you would expect the leading figures in universities like this in the US, because this is at Columbia, you would expect them to really get their act in together. And yet they really don't seem to have done that. So this is really disappointing, and I think a really terrible development, really.
Yeah. So one of the one of the things that was sent in the text messages was one of them saying, "This is difficult to listen to, but I'm trying to keep an open mind to learn about this point of view." It's like that's maybe as nice as they can be when hearing somebody say that, look, that's the fact that Jews were slaughtered for being Jews, and protests are happening in the university to support that, and support that happening again and again as the murderers promised. It's difficult for them to hear a different viewpoint, and that tells you that's kind of the theory, and we saw the practice, in effect while this was going on, and while the university president allowed this to happen and was criticized by some staff at the time for not being supportive enough of the terrorists or pro-terrorist rioters. So again, remember this inspired what we on the channel call the campus Intifada across universities in the U.S. That with things that included, physical attacks on Jews. One of the popular things that to do was to, hold hands in a chain and prevent Jews from going to class or going into the library or just, moving around. Scenes that, many people compared to what happened in Nazi Germany because, that is identical in some cases to what happened. There's similar images from Germany or Austria, I believe, of Jewish students not being allowed into into the university. And again, we say this and it kind of sounds like the easy way to go about it, but imagine how would these same exact people respond if white students decided not to let black students onto the campus, uh, you know, uh, and that is what we're dealing here. But we're dealing with the legitimate form of bigotry in essence, which is Jew hatred, and legitimate because it's being legitimized by the intellectuals, by the universities, by the people who were sitting on that panel. And by the way, the dean when he apologized, he also claimed that this was an invasion of their privacy. Look, you're in public, you have your phone out there, and yeah, generally maybe you don't want to take pictures of what somebody else is texting, but when it shows you the reasons why Jewish students are in the position that they're in, then you know what, maybe that calls for such invasion of privacy, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, that protest sounds a bit weak and ineffectual, doesn't it, given the content of what was being sent between them. It wasn't like he was sending private messages to his wife or something like that. I think you're right to hit on the fact that if these students were from some other kind of minority group, some kind of other racial minority, I think this would be taken much more seriously. Because we all know how universities are really kind of turning themselves inside out over the last few decades, however many years, over diversity programs, equity programs, inclusion programs, all this kind of thing. And I think a lot of the officials in the kind of university apparatus really believe in that kind of thing. And so then you sort of have to ask yourself, why is it when it comes to the Jewish students, they seem to show such contempt towards the kind of complaints the Jewish students are making, which aren't all that different in at least the content of what they might be alleging about experiencing discrimination, hostility, or even violence from other students who are wanting from minority groups who the faculty are feeling more sympathetic to. So why is it that they don't feel very sympathetic? And I think it's a difficult question to answer in some ways, but at the same time, I think David Baddiel is quite persuasive in his book, which is titled Jews Don't Count, when he's talking about how there's a kind of hierarchy of the oppressed and how these people think. And for Jews, their experience isn't counted as highly, for example, in the States as Black Americans or as and various other kinds of racial minorities. That kind of prejudice is given a much higher status and therefore is taken much more seriously. Whereas anti-Semitism either is kind of felt not to be a serious issue at all, or not to exist, or it's given a much lower priority. And so you get blind spots on this kind of thing. And then I think coming in at the side, given that these people in the faculty are kind of in the milieu of such terrible attitudes towards Israel and such a warped view of the conflict, because the Jewish students, perhaps not wholly, but in significant part probably are Zionists and probably support Israel. They're treated with contempt because of that, because probably to some extent the faculty do think, well, if they're Zionists, yeah, they're pretty rotten. They maybe deserve what they get. I think that's some of the attitude that's coming through as well, because some of the students on the panel were talking about being proud of having ties to Israel and of being Zionists and so on. So that's some of why I think you see this disparity. And it's an issue that really needs to be taken head on and taken very seriously, because this is something that's permeating the left. There's issues of anti-Semitism on the right, but they don't kind of go under the radar like this. People can recognize anti-Semitism on the right generally for just how nasty and insidious it is. But anti-Semitism on the left, it gets given a kind of free pass in the culture because we have a very simplistic kind of stupid attitude towards recognizing it. I think that's what we see going on this panel.
Yeah, I think that's because the left tends to be more diplomatic, and I'm not saying that as a compliment. We talked about this a couple of days ago when we talked about Nick Fuentes and his new BFF Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who rejects his friendship, even though it makes perfect sense for them to be allied, because for him, he is, a openly anti-Semitic, openly a white supremacist, whereas she has to mince words because that's what her side likes to do. So even in this context of, yeah, Jewish students are assumed to be Zionists. I mean, that's an excuse. That's not a reason. Yesterday there was another so-called protest in Los Angeles, anti-Israel protest, in front of a synagogue. So even there, presumably, I don't know. I don't know the type of synagogue. There are anti-Zionist Jews out there. But you go to a synagogue, it's safer to assume that there are Zionists there than in a mosque. So that's where they went. And look, with the way. Actually, you know what? We'll talk about the way Columbia University is dealing with this in a second. But thank you, Bonnie, for the super chat. Um, Thank you, PC, for the super chat. PC says, yet they forget 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust, so anti-Semitism is a problem. Yeah, I mean, it's also, ironic that when these people, they compare Israel to Nazis, and on the other hand, they advocate for ideas when it comes to Jews that are identical to the views of the Nazis, and they support, modern day Nazis in the form of the Palestinians. So yeah, there's a lot of irony on that side. That what I call diplomacy comes with not just lying to others, but lying to yourself as well. And we see that in how this specific incident was handled and how generally they handle uh, their approach to the outside world.
Yes, well, I think something that I guess you could say October 7th has done, but broadly the response to October 7th has done, has revealed to a lot of people in the world just how rotten academia really is. Although, let's say over the last 10 years, 15 years, there's been a much greater degree of controversy in Western culture about the problems of academia. People have been much more aware of them, wanting to talk about them. They might talk about them in fairly watered down terms like woke or political correctness, but they're getting at the notion that there's a real problem with the ideas and the influence that's coming from academia. But there's still a lot of the culture which isn't really clued into it. And just the fact that students coming from top universities like Columbia, who are supposed to be the best and brightest in the country, could be so vile, so singularly vile, and so hostile and so willing to love Hamas and call for violence and engage in this kind of anti-Semitism, I think showed a lot of people that there's a real problem here. Like, oh my God, how could they come up like this? So, and academics really are the people who you would expect to understand anti-Semitism, at least in a certain sense. I mean, one of the kind of great kind of academics on anti-Semitism in recent decades was Deborah Lipstadt, who was a real hero in the US when she kind of fought that libel trial against David Irving. And she was a real kind of intellectual celebrity in lots of ways. And now I think she works at the UN as a kind of special, advisor on anti-Semitism, something like that. And yet it's really changed. And I think you see the way that the conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, has this kind of really radical bent to it, where people who I think in other circumstances wouldn't be anti-Semites or who wouldn't be unsympathetic towards students who are talking about their experiences of anti-Semitism really are. And I think, if it weren't for the real hostility to Israel and the real hostility to Zionism, must be very common. It seems to be very common amongst these academic institutions and amongst the academic kind of bureaucracy that these four people are in. I don't think we'd be seeing these views expressed. So there's a lot that's really revealing here.
So let's go a little bit into details. This is from I'm reading from an article about this in NBC. The university said the administrators, the ones who were suspended, worked for its undergraduate Columbia College, which hosted the panel discussion Jewish Life on Campus, Past, Present, and Future during an alumni reunion on May 31st. So yeah, this wasn't last week, and actually the story started coming out on June 12th. So it's not that new a story. The university said the college's dean, Josef Sorett, informed his team on Thursday that the three administrators were being put on leave. Columbia College is attending to this situation with the utmost seriousness, a college spokesperson said. We are committed to confronting anti-Semitism, discrimination, and hate, and taking concrete action to ensure that our is a community of respect and healthy dialogue where everybody feels valued and safe. I mean, kudos to him for not saying we're committed to fighting against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. But these, these statements are so empty that they could be copy pasted and sent around from one university to another, from one company to another, from one political leader or anybody who actually says a bit too much of what they actually think can use a sort of a similar statement. Again, this is a difference in this sense between anti-Semitism on the left and anti-Semitism on the right. There's very little attempt to hide who they are on the right, whereas the left is all about trying to hide who they are, which is probably the only way they can sell their views to any semi-decent humans, although well, we have to question whether humans are still semi-decent when they buy that. Thank you, Jonathan, for the super chat. There's also a story from a couple of days ago that not Columbia, Washington Free Beacon that broke this story sent a reporter to Josef Sorett's house, and he called the police, which is interesting. I mean, I'm not a fan of sending people to knock on somebody's door of their house, especially since, why not send them to his office? But it's interesting. They also note that he called the police after back in 2020, he called for defunding the police. So this is, the reason the left needs to hide some of its views is because, they disagree with themselves often, and or at least can't practice what they preach, and they need to mask it and have some sort of plausible deniability.
Sorry, I wouldn't unmute for a second there. I think perhaps the other aspect of this story that people should just appreciate is that, so why is it that the students at places like Columbia, where I think the protests were quite so noticeable and were quite so large, why did the students feel confident to go out there and do what they did, and to be quite so hostile and quite so nasty and quite so in your face about it, especially if you're a Jewish student? Well, I think part of the reason why they were doing that was because they felt that the faculty were giving them a bit of a thumbs up. Now, faculty in some of the universities were kind of giving them a bit of backlash and were clamping down on them. But when you have a kind of atmosphere where you feel like the faculty are kind of looking the other way, they kind of agree with you, they're not really against you, and not only have they then actually taught you the ideas which are going out there and implementing, then you feel like you've been given a sanction by them, and you've been giving the thumbs up, even if it is rather covertly. So when we see that members of the faculty are sending, vomiting face emojis, or saying, oh, this Jewish person is just using this for an opportunity to fundraise, which maybe they didn't mean it to sound quite how that sounds, but it sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? Then it's hardly a surprise that the students go out there and do this. So the rot goes all the way to the top, or the fish rots from the head. I think, that saying. So this isn't just a kind of scandal rag story where the deans and his lackeys have been caught saying something embarrassing that they shouldn't have, but who really cares? This is indicative of the whole problem. And it's a problem that doesn't just exist at Columbia, it's a problem that exists really in all seats of higher learning in the Western world, I'd have to say. That's how prevalent these ideas are, but certainly in a lot of the top universities and top colleges, because in a sense, they're the most radical. And so that's part of what I think you have to appreciate and part of why this is going on.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is you said there's a reason why they felt confident to do this, and yeah, it is why the students felt confident to riot, and there's in large part it is because they're not only supported by the faculty, they're encouraged by the faculty, and their views in large part are the result of what they're being taught there. Of course, this wasn't only students, but it was in part students, and it was supported by faculty. We saw in other universities, professors participating in the riots. So yeah, but they're also there's another reason they were confident because they were. I don't know if this is why they were confident, but they were hiding their face. They were wearing masks. This was a policy. You need to hide your face when there are cameras around. So yeah, anti-Semitism on the left isn't just about hiding what you really think. It's also about hiding everything about who you are, including you don't want yourself associated with the views that you do express, and the views that you do express are kind of not fully, fully what you're actually thinking, unless it comes out from time to time. So you mentioned the vomit emoji, and that was in response to they were discussing an op-ed that was published somewhere by the rabbi in the university. One of the things the rabbi said was that he's concerned about normalization of Hamas. He says discussions about Zionism or a one-state or two-state solution or the occupation or the IDF are welcome on campus, but what isn't welcome on campus is the idea that slaughtering Jews is wrong. So and yeah, so this is she didn't like that. I don't know why she didn't like that, but presumably, yeah, it hit close to home in a sense, because again, the reason certain conversations are accepted or encouraged in a university, the people responsible for what is encouraged in a university are faculty, are the leadership, and well, we see where that has led to in Colombia.
Yes, well, as you say, the article that she was responding to with the vomiting emoji was saying that you can discuss all areas of the conflict, one state, two state, whatever. We don't think it's acceptable for you to be discussing whether you can go and kill Jewish students. And this is something which is just so ridiculous, apparently. That seems to be what the vomiting emojis were saying. And just try and put yourself in the headspace of these kind of people who believe this kind of thing. I think that's acceptable, because presumably what they believe, it's not even that she presumably believes that it is okay to go around slaughtering Jews. I would find that a bit hard to attribute to her. But she presumably believes that all of this concern is trumped up, is overblown, is ridiculous. Now, as we've already said, I doubt she would feel that way in the case of some other minority group who is making that kind of complaint. But how could any of these people believe this? Not only with the war going on in Israel, where you see the Jews really under attack. The reason why Israel's under attack is because it is, home to a lot of Jews, and it is the Jewish state. That's the problem that Hamas has. But even then, just the problem that Jews in the Western world are facing, either in London, as we've covered, or in America more broadly. You really have to be putting your head in the sand, putting your fingers in your ears, and not wanting to see what's going on right now. And to be a person like that rather than someone who's seeing the rise in anti-Semitism and who is really shocked by it and concerned by it, because most of us believed that that was something consigned to history, whereas actually it's something that's much more present. It's just so despicable to not be the latter kind of person, but to be the former, who believes this is all just made up and overdone. And yet that's seems to be the attitude. I mean, it is the attitude of these four people, and presumably seems to be the attitude that's more widespread amongst a lot of university leaders. And that is just so, so bad.
Yeah, thank you, Loresetto, for the super chat. Loresetto says this deplorable situation existed long prior to October 7th. Abuse is seen as a form of humor, making left oppression cool. Yeah, I mean, there's generally, generally issues in the culture beyond anti-Semitism, and there are more and more, I think, nihilistic elements out there that we see manifest themselves in different ways. And of course, as nihilism goes, supporting Hamas is top of the list. And so, yeah, I agree. But not everybody in America is anti-Israel. We need to remember that. I think as the population goes, America is the most pro-Israel country out there. One of those people who support Israel is RFK Jr. Is he Israel's great hope in November? That is the topic of tomorrow's episode of the Daily Objective. Stay tuned for that. Stay tuned also for the reality show. Comes up in a couple of minutes. We're going to talk about the rescued hostages, some of what they've been saying, some other developments related to hostages. And I see that I haven't read it, but I see that there's some chat about Russia in the chat. Wednesday's episode of the Daily Objective will be about why Israel and Ukraine are essentially the same war and the same side, and you cannot be consistently on the side of one of those two and not on the side of the other. But that's all coming up in the coming days. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Morgan, and we'll see you in a couple of minutes on the reality show.